The echoes of Hollow Grove. The forest had not always been this way. Lena had heard the rumors, the stories of Hollow Grove. It was a place that had a reputation, a dark and twisted one that no one spoke of directly. Those who had grown up in the nearby town knew better than to wander too deep into its heart. It had been abandoned for decades. The trees were so thick that daylight barely touched the forest floor, and the air always carried a sense of something forgotten. The winds whispered, but never clearly. It was said that anyone who entered and ventured far enough to reach the old clearing would never come back the same, if they came back at all. But Lena had never been one to believe in folklore. She was a skeptic, a person who viewed the world through a lens of logic and reason, and the idea of something unnatural haunting a forest seemed like nothing more than superstition. It had been a long day of hiking, and she had stumbled upon a weathered map that hinted at an ancient stone circle deep within the woods. She knew the trail well. It was one of the less traveled paths leading out of town. It would be a quiet, peaceful place to explore, she thought. A place untouched by the modern world, offering a break from the noise of her usual life. But as she ventured further, something about the woods began to feel wrong. The first sign was the silence. At first, Lena didn't think much of it. The usual chatter of birds and rustling of leaves was absent, but the air had been thick with humidity, and maybe the animals had taken shelter from the heat. She had noticed it when she first entered, but chalked it up to the oppressive humidity hanging in the air. Yet, as the hours stretched on, the silence began to gnaw at her, becoming unbearable. It was more than just the absence of sound. It was a void, like the forest itself had swallowed up every trace of life. The wind was still, the leaves hung limp. Not a single insect buzzed around her. Lena pushed on, dismissing the unsettling feeling in her chest as nothing more than a trick of the mind. She was almost there, she thought. A few more miles to the stone circle, and she'd be able to turn back. The sunlight was starting to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows among the trees, but she wasn't worried. There was enough light left for her to make it back, or so she thought. Her steps began to slow as the trees grew denser, their gnarled branches twisting in odd directions. The path, once clear and wide, was now barely discernible. What was once a trail had turned into an overgrown mess, and Lena began to realize that maybe the map wasn't as reliable as she had assumed. That's when she heard it. A soft whisper. It was so faint that she thought it might be the wind, but the air was still. She stood motionless, straining her ears to listen. There it was again, a low, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of leaves, but it came from deeper within the forest. No animal could make a noise like that. And then, she saw it. A shadow moved between the trees. Something tall, too tall for any normal animal, hunched low to the ground as if trying to avoid detection. Her heart leapt into her throat as she froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. Was it a person? No, the silhouette was wrong. It had too many angles, too many limbs that didn't seem to belong to anything human. It glided silently, almost like it wasn't moving at all, just passing through the trees as if it was part of the very woods themselves. Lena's breath caught in her chest. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, but her legs felt like lead. The whispering intensified, now growing louder, like 1,000 voices murmuring just beyond the reach of understanding. It was as if the forest itself was trying to speak, but the words were lost in a strange, distorted language. Her eyes locked onto the shadow as it continued to move deeper into the woods, the shape growing more distorted the longer she watched. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. Lena's heart was pounding in her ears. She couldn't stay here any longer. She had to leave, but when she turned to retrace her steps, she found herself lost. The trees that had once seemed familiar were now foreign. The path she had walked was gone, swallowed up by the undergrowth. Every direction she turned led her to a new set of twisted branches and endless shadows. It was as though the forest itself had shifted, rearranged its layout while she was distracted by the strange figure. Panic set in. She started to run, but the ground beneath her feet felt uneven, treacherous, like the forest itself was pulling her deeper into its heart. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed through the thorns and brambles, ignoring the sharp pricks of pain as they scraped against her skin. She could hear the whispers again, closer now. Louder. The shadows around her seemed to move, twisting and stretching as though they were alive. Lena stopped, her breath catching as she turned in a circle, searching for any sign of the path. And then, the ground beneath her feet gave way. She tumbled forward, hitting the earth hard. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and she lay there for a moment, dazed. But before she could push herself up, she noticed something strange. The forest was different here. She had fallen into a small clearing. It was open, but the trees surrounding it were ancient, their trunks so thick and gnarled that they seemed to twist and writhe like living creatures. At the center of the clearing was a stone structure, ancient and weathered, its surface covered in moss and vines. It looked like a circle of standing stones, but each stone was carved with strange, indecipherable symbols. The air was colder now. It wasn't just the temperature, there was something else, something that made her skin crawl. The whispers were louder than ever, and Lena could swear she could feel eyes watching her from all sides. The shadows began to shift again, this time with a purpose. The trees seemed to close in on the clearing, their branches reaching out like fingers. The whispers grew into words, but they weren't in any language she recognized. She scrambled to her feet, backing away from the stones, her breath coming faster now. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and the world around her seemed to distort. A figure stepped from the shadows. It was the same one from before, but it was no longer a mere silhouette. Now, it was fully formed, an impossibly tall, gaunt figure with too many limbs, too many eyes, all staring at her with an intense, unblinking gaze. The thing opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices merging into one. They seemed to come from the stones, from the trees, from the very ground beneath her feet. Lena stumbled backward, her body shaking with fear. She had no way out. The forest had consumed her, and whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to let her leave. The ground beneath her feet rumbled, and the trees groaned in response. The air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. The figure stepped forward, its limbs moving with unnatural fluidity, and the whispers seemed to wrap around her, pulling her closer to the stones. And then, everything went silent. For a brief, terrible moment, there was nothing but stillness. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She stood frozen, unable to move or speak. Then, the whispers returned. But now, they were different. They were calling her name. Lena. Lena. The voice was familiar. It was her own voice. Her eyes widened in horror as she realized something terrible. The thing in front of her, the figure with too many limbs and eyes, wasn't the only thing in the clearing. There were others. Shadows began to take form all around her. Human shapes, figures she recognized, faces she knew. They were all watching her, their eyes empty, their mouths twisted in silent screams. And in the center of it all, the figure with too many eyes raised a hand, as if beckoning her closer. Lena took a step backward, but her feet wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, unable to escape. The shadows were closing in, and the whispers grew louder, the voices of the past now mingling with her own, all calling out in unison. Lena, come home.